So basically, we're going to continue looking at cost push inflation and the various factors that could lead to it manifesting itself within the macroeconomy. Part 4 of our lecture on unemployment and inflation. So basically, again, cost push inflation can manifest itself by virtue of there being an increase in the wage rate of employees, leading to a higher level of cost for the company concerned. So because firms are in the business of making a profit in the ultimate productive cycle, if labor being one of your costs of production increase, it stands to reason that the finished product is also going to carry that increase in price. So it says here that when the wages increase, this leads to a rise in the cost of production and hence cost push inflation. It also speaks that depreciation of the exchange rate in the country under consideration. Depreciation. Remember what we're saying to you is that with depreciation, it means then that goods coming into the domestic economy are going to find themselves to be more expensive. Depreciation causes exports to be cheaper, but imports to be more expensive. So if, for instance, you have a situation whereby you're importing your raw materials and those raw materials, the economy would have gone through a depreciation in its currency. It means then that to the extent that those raw materials are going to be more expensive in the ultimate production cycle, firms are going to then pass on those higher costs in the form of higher profits. Sorry, in the form of higher prices, my bad. So inflation that's caused by the changes in the aggregate supply curve, which is associated with cost push inflation, is shown on the right side of the graph. And you see that is that by virtue of the various factors or the potential factors that we have discussed in the past, your aggregate supply curve shifts to the left. You see the AS prime, whereby prices are actually increasing. Okay? So that's it in terms of understanding how cost push and demand push inflation manifest themselves. Make sure you acquaint yourselves with these two factors because of the fact that at the end of the day, you're going to see those as part of your midterm assessment. Ensure you know what is meant by cost push inflation and show what is meant by demand pull inflation. Now, one of the things, again, we said in the preliminary parts of the lecture is that inflation reduces the purchasing power of money. With inflation, $1 today is going to buy less tomorrow. So because the purchasing power of money is being reduced, it says here that inflation can actually cause a reduction in the standard of living. All right? And if you have a situation whereby prices keep on rising continuously, persons become concerned as to whether or not their income is going to be kept abreast with inflation. Because if it's not, again, it goes back to the first bullet, it's a case where we're going to find our purchasing power of money declining over time. So if you go to slide 36, it says here that in terms of the association between inflation and spending, it says here that the higher the rate of inflation, the greater the decline in your nominal income purchasing power. So for those of you who are employed, when you get your pay, it's what's called your nominal salary. It says, that nominal salary or your nominal income, it doesn't really measure your real purchasing power. You have to then what? Convert nominal to real to determine whether or not you're better off. And here is where we're going to introduce an equation to determine whether or not you're better off in real terms, where you have R, which is for real, is equal to nominal, which is N minus small I for inflation. So R equal n minus n. So from slide 36, that's one of the equations that we wish to deduce. R is equal to n minus m. So in terms of inflation and income, it says here that if the CPI increases, as an example, and your nominal income remains the same, okay, so R is equal to n minus n. N remains the same, I increases. Then obviously, since I is that part that you're reducing from the equation, and that is increasing, then it means then that R is going to fall. So your purchasing power reduces again as inflation increases. And we said there's also a potential direct link with the standard of living. Your standard of living is then going to fall if your nominal income, the N in the equation, doesn't keep abreast with inflation. So here's an example. Suppose your nominal income in 2009 is 50,000 and prices increase by 2.02% in 2009. Then in real terms, your income is only $24,752. So this is how they would have done the calculation in terms of coming up what your income really means in real terms when we take inflation into consideration. Suppose, however, your nominal income of 50,000 rise by 10% and the CPI increase from 2.02 to 2.07. Then what? Your real income will now be 26,570. So what you're seeing is that as prices increase, if your nominal income is either increasing at the same rate or greater, your purchasing power is either going to remain unchanged or increase if the nominal amount is greater than the inflation rate of increase. Okay, if you have any questions that you wish to really have me address directly, if this sounds a bit too technical for you, please let me know. So it says here now that while prices have increased in 2009, persons are really better off when you compare it to the previous slide, whereby prices increased but they did not get an increase in the nominal wage. So once the nominal rate of your salary increase is greater than or equal to your inflation rate, then your purchasing power is either going to remain unchanged or increasing. Now, one of the reasons why we have to really follow inflation is that inflation is a very important measure that the persons who are engaged in wage negotiation use. So whether it's the Antigua and Barbuda Trades and Labor Union, the Antigua and Barbuda Workers Union, whichever the case may be, when they negotiate for wage increase, they will tell you that part of it is on reflection of what is happening in terms of prices. So here's an example. If the expected rate of inflation is 3%, so remember our equation, R is equal to N minus M. And the Antigua and Barbuda Workers Union, they agree that persons should have a real wage increase of 5%. How much would the union and the employer agree on in terms of your nominal increase? How much? Simple. All you do is you plug back the figures back in the equation. What do we know? We know I. So R is equal to N minus 3 because I is 3%. We know what? At the bottom, 5. So R, which is 5, so 5 is equal to N minus 3. In order then for you to get that 5% increase in your real wage, then it means then that the union and the employer, they will have to agree to your wages increasing by 8%. 5 is equal to 8 minus 3. We know the 5, which is what we expect to get in terms of the outturn. We know what the inflation is. It means that in order for us to get that increase, real increase in our wages of 5%, then both union and the employer must agree to an increase of 8%. Okay, so now we're going to make a distinction in terms of what's called anticipated and unanticipated inflation. And when you anticipate something, it means then that you expect it. So the same thing with prices. If you anticipate inflation, you expect prices to increase. If you unanticipate it, it means then that prices will increase. Prices could increase, but that increase could caught you off guard. It would have caught you off guard because you didn't expect it. So it says here that unanticipated inflation creates more problems for the economy than does anticipated inflation. It makes sense, because if you anticipate it, you can better plan. If it's unanticipated, you cannot plan as effective. So he says here that to the extent that inflation is higher or lower than you actually expect, it arbitrarily creates what we call winners and losers. And again, it goes back to our equation, R is equal to N minus Y. So what he's saying to you is that if it is higher than expected, inflation is higher than expected, the winners are all those who had contracted to pay at a price that anticipate a lower inflation. If it is higher than expected, the winners are those who had contracted to pay at a price that would have anticipated a lower inflation. Okay, because it goes back again to the equation R is equal to N minus I. So here's the example. Inflation is higher than expected. So it is 6%. You expect inflation to be 6%. Okay, so again, if we were to use a union example, they want persons to have 5% increase in real wage. Inflation, they expect it to be 3%. So it means then they're going to negotiate for persons to get an 8% increase. But what? If it actually turns out to be lower than the 3%, but end up being 2%, it means then in real terms, you're going to get an increase of 6%, because the contract would have been negotiated on the higher rate of the 3%, but in actuality, it then turns out to be 2%. So they would have already agreed that you're going to get 5% increase based on a 3% rate. Then they would have had to have given you the 8%, but to the extent now that then in actuality prices actually turn out to be lower, you're going to then end up with 6%. So that's what he's saying to you, is that if it is higher than expected, the winner are those who had contracted to pay the price that anticipated lower inflation rate. The losers are all those who agreed to sell at that price. So if inflation is lower than expected, the reverse is what is going to be the case. Those who anticipate it to be lower and decided to put a contract, end up doing a contract that is higher, would then be the ones who will actually lose. So the next one basically speaks to understanding the fact that there's some form of transactional cost that is associated with inflation. It says that when prices are stable, people correctly believe they can predict future prices and can plan accordingly. But if inflation changes unexpectedly, planning gets harder, which undermines the ability for money to serve as a link between the present and the future. So if prices are unstable, it's difficult for you to plan. When dealing with the rest of the world, they must also anticipate how the value of the dollar might change, relative to other foreign currencies, because it's going to affect also your export capacity, as the case may be. So this is it in terms of chapter 4 of our presentation on this.